Hello everyone, I'm Janine Kakmar with PHTV Channel 4 Palos Heights, back with our show all about books. On this show we'll talk about books, writing, authors, and publishing, and we'll also have a special guest with us today to talk about what they are reading. But before we get to our guest, we're going to talk about some of the new releases coming out in September. And September and October are one of the big months in the publishing industry. So we have all the heavy-hitting authors coming out with their stories and new series. So we've got a lot of good things to talk about today. So let's get started with our featured titles. Our first featured title is, we're back with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. She's coming back in her fifth book titled The Girl Who Takes an Eye for an Eye by David Lagerkrantz. This series started back in the early 2000s with author Stieg Larsson, who wrote The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and two other books. And then he died suddenly. He actually saw 10 books in the series and only saw 3 published. And then the estate of Stieg Larsson asked another Swedish crime journalist, David Lagerkrantz, to continue the series. So he wrote book 4 last year, and in this book, book 5, it's coming out in September. It's back with this main character, Lisbeth Salander. She's back, and for those of you who don't know her, she's actually a very interesting character. She's a brilliant hacker, an obstinate outsider, and a volatile seeker of justice for herself and for others. And she teams up again in this book with the journalist Mikael Blomkvist to, again, solve the endless mysteries of her childhood and to uncover secrets in another thrilling episode in this series. So that's book 5 of the Millennium series there. Our next featured title is Caroline, Little House Revisited by Sarah Miller. So all of you Little House on the Prairie fans, you get a chance to revisit those beloved characters in a new light. Author Sarah Miller was granted permission by the Little House Heritage Trust to recreate the beauty and hardships and the joy of the frontier life and to bring to life the courageous, resilient, and loving pioneer woman, Caroline Ingalls. Now, this historical novel starts in the cold days of February in 1870 when the Ingalls family decides that they're going to leave their comfort of the big woods in Wisconsin to seek out a new life in the Indian Territory in Kansas. Of course, there's Caroline with her husband Charles and their 2 daughters, Mary and Laura. So for more than 80 years, generations of readers have been enchanted by the adventures of the American frontier's most famous child, Laura Ingalls Wilder. And now, you'll get to read a story that's told from Caroline, the mother's viewpoint, and it's reviewed to be a captivating tale of family, fidelity, hardships, and survival. Our next book feature title we have takes us to England with international best-selling author Ken Follett. Now, I know many of you out there have been waiting for the 3rd book in the Kingsbridge saga, and he's here with A Column of Fire. Now, this series started with The Pillars of the Earth, and then World Without End, and now he's come out with the 3rd book, The Column of Fire, and these are all stories that are set in the Middle Ages, England, in the fictional city of Kingsbridge. So it starts in 1558, when the ancient stones of the Kingsbridge Castle look down on a city that's just ripped apart by religious tensions between the Catholics and the Protestants. Then you have a conflict between the royals and the commoners, and they all clash, testing friendships and loyalty and love. And this book is set in one of the most turbulent and revolutionary times in history. But it's reviewed to be his most exciting book yet. So I know that's a really difficult claim to have there because the first 2 books were, if you all read them, they're incredible. So this book is said to delight all the Kingsbridge fans are going to be happy, and the new readers who try it will find a new author that they like. And with this book weighing with over 900 pages and weighing almost 3 pounds, there's just plenty of book to go around. So if you guys haven't read the first 2 books, you'll have a chance to read it before The Column of Fire comes out. So our next featured title is The Good People by Hannah Kent. Now, we know this author from her first book that came out a couple years ago called Burial Rites, which was it read like a literary novel, but with the pace of a thriller. And it was inspired by real-life events of a woman who was accused of murder in the 1800s in Iceland. So her new book, The Good People, is also based on real-life events in 19th century Ireland. And it tells the story of three women who are drawn together to rescue a child from a superstitious community that's fallen on hard times. So it's a story about belief and devoted love, and it's both terrifying and thrilling. Now, this book was shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. And in an interview, the author was saying that she actually got the idea for her second book while she was working on her first book. She was translating several of her sources from Iceland and was too tired to do that anymore. She picked up an old English newspaper and saw an article from 1826 about this trial of this woman. And she actually became haunted by this woman. Her name was, the real life person's name was Anne Roche. So she ends up writing this book to give form to the story of this woman. So again, if you haven't read her first book, you can look at that book while you're waiting for this one to come out this month. And our final feature is a feature I'm very excited about. It's by the author Robert Olmsted, who I read one of his earlier books. It was a Heartland Prize winner called The Coal Black Horse. That came out back in 2008, I believe. And it's a story that still has stuck with me. The characters are just, I just can't forget them. And it's a story about a woman who had a premonition about her husband, who was a soldier in the Civil War. And she was very fearful of his well-being, so she sent her only child, her 14-year-old son, to the battlefields to find his father and bring him back. Well, of course, the boy feels like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a grand adventure. But of course, the moment he leaves the farm, he finds that the world is a much bigger and much darker place than he ever imagined while living on the farm. So, and it's only through the gift of this black horse that he gets that he learns how to survive this most important journey of his life. That was his first book. Now, the second book is said to be even better, and it takes place in 1873 after the war. These are different characters. These books are standalones, they're not related. But it's about a woman, Elizabeth Coughlin, who ended up a bankrupt widow when her husband dies suddenly. And but he had planned this big buffalo hunt in the Comanche territory, so she's forced to take this hunt through. So she's got a whole crew of people who are depending on her. She has no money, no job security. She knows nothing about buffalo hunting, but she teams up with her mysterious brother-in-law, and they face prairie fires and floods and heat and cold and rattlesnakes and rabies, and of course the Comanche. But what Olmsted does, the author does, he makes the reader pay attention to the story with his mix of poetic language set against the violent and strange and just unforgiving landscape. And it's been reviewed as another gorgeous, brutal masterpiece from a great American writer. So those are some of the feature titles that are coming out in September. And the next two slides you'll see are some of the New York Times bestsellers coming out. And again, as I mentioned, September and October are huge months for the publishing industry, so you're going to see some big names, starting with, of course, Stephen King, writing with his own son, Owen King, on their book, Sleeping Beauties. They, of course, are going to be in Anderson Bookstore at Naperville this month, actually, at the end of the month on September 29th. So if you guys want to go out and see them and hear of them, why they came up with this story, you can go see them. Nelson DeMille is out with his new title, Cuban Affair. Catherine Coulter is out with her 21st book in the FBI thriller Enigma. Clive Cussler is out with Romanov Ransom, which is a Sam and Remy Fargo adventure. And for you Mitford series fans, Jan Caron is back with her book, To Be Where You Are. And Harlan Coben is out with Don't Let Go. Todd Charles, who's, if you remember, we talked about this author, who's actually two authors, is a mother and son duo, out with a new book, A Casualty of War, which is the latest in their Bess Crawford series. And Anne Perry, who's out with her new one, An Echo of Murder, which is a William Monk novel, which is set in the Victorian London period. So you've heard about some of our featured titles, some of our New York Times books being released, and now it's time to visit with our guest, local resident George Fear. George, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
George is an English teacher at Sandburg High School. He's a winning baseball coach there, and a library board member here in the Palos Heights Library. So thanks, George, for coming. He's busy days, and he managed to make some time to come here, so we're great. Now, you've been teaching at 11 years, for like 11 years at Sandburg?
Yes, 11 years teaching English, mostly sophomores and seniors.
Okay. And a baseball coach.
Correct.
Yep. I was able to see one of your games, and it actually was so tense I had to leave and sit in the car because I couldn't take the last inning. It was really intense. You ended up winning, so that was great.
It was.
Yeah. So how did you get involved with coaching baseball?
I grew up playing baseball. I played baseball at Marist High School and then went on to play at Millikan University.
Okay.
And
you were a catcher there?
Correct. Yeah, I was a catcher there. Had a great experience playing, and then as I was finishing my degree in education in English, I wanted to make sure coaching was part of my teaching career. And I was fortunate to get hired at Sandburg, which has a great baseball program and a lot of talented kids. And started with the freshman team my first few years, and then moved my way up to the varsity 4 or 5 years into my career.
So you coach specifically the pitchers then?
Correct. Yeah, pitchers and catchers
Okay.
I work with. Yep.
All right. And this is, you talked about some of the books you're going to be talking about, and I see that a lot of them deal with the issues of coaching and motivating students and that kind of thing. So
Yes.
yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that. So, you bought a stack of books to talk about, because I asked George, being an English teacher, I know he likes to read and he can talk about books. So you bought some titles with you that you've been reading, but I know we had this conversation a little while ago about, why people read what they read, and you see a lot of different things when you're teaching. I see a lot of things with my job about the different titles. Even with myself, though, I can remember being a young girl going to my older sister's rooms and reading all the romance books when I was like 14 years old, right? And then different periods of your life, you're reading different things. And now you find yourself reading the stack of books that you're reading now, right?
Yes, I think it is interesting. I definitely started out reading much more fiction, so in high school and into college, and even early in my career, trying to determine the books that I wanted to teach my students, and also fiction that I was interested in, and a lot of short stories and different short story writers, and I would try to pick one author in the summer and do a short story study, with that author, whether it was Ernest Hemingway or F. Scott Fitzgerald or any other more modern writer. I really like that idea of doing a study. And more recently, I've gotten more into books that deal with more behavioral psychology.
Okay.
And I think some of that is helping to inform my coaching and my teaching, and I'm a pretty young parent as well.
Yeah.
So trying to figure out what it is that my kids are doing.
What can I do?
What can I do to help these kids? So
how many kids do you have?
I have 3.
Oh, yeah.
So, and they're 5, 4, and 3.
Oh yeah.
So we're stacked up, and
You're outnumbered.
we're outnumbered for sure. I just dropped the 2 off at preschool and the 1 off at kindergarten.
Oh
so
my gosh.
yeah, they're a handful, but they're a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So so I think that's kind of where I've started to shift and change. And there's been a lot of, I like the quick reads too, that aren't necessarily novels. The Psychology Today blogs or Farnham Street blogs that have a lot of different information about a plethora of things, but a lot of behavioral psychology that, and I'm really interested in it.
Yeah,
So.
And it's funny. I was talking to a woman the other day who was, she wanted to be a writer, and she was saying, she's an older woman, but she's saying, I just don't know how I'm going to get published and all this kind of thing. And it's like, there's so many, like you just mentioned reading blogs, and it's like, there's so many other things to read in addition to books. We can get our reading sources from so many things, just like she could get her publishing done in so many other different venues, whether it be blogs or something. So yeah, there's more than books that we are reading. We're reading, different sources and online things, and so that does have a big effect too.
Definitely, I think it shifts the way we read, especially with nonfiction. I mean, with fiction, I consume fiction the same way I always have. I start from the beginning and I go all the way through. But with nonfiction text, I feel pretty comfortable jumping around and kind of trying to pull something quickly that I can grab onto and have one quick takeaway from that one session of reading. And I think a lot of that kind of comes from how I consume media on the internet and through my Twitter feed and who I follow and things of that nature. So.
And that's funny because I was just listening to some news, something that I was listening to, and they were talking about the ads for the Super Bowl are mimicking ads that are found on the internet, which are 6-second ads. So you're going from a 30-second ad to 6 seconds. So so these are, people have done all the research on our attention spans now. So we're down to 6 seconds, folks. Like, I guess you're not watching my show anymore.
Well, ask me how my high schoolers' attention spans are. If
oh, absolutely.
And
I will ask you.
No, and I think that's definitely an issue that we have to navigate now as educators. There's definitely a change in not necessarily their depth of analysis. I think that's always been consistent, but maybe kind of the breadth in which they're going to go about doing the work has shifted a little bit. And so I think we got to meet them where they are. And so that's
has that
shifted.
affected on what choice you pick for them to read? And
I think so. I think the way I break up assignments has definitely shifted and changed. So like one strategy that I use, and part of it I've actually mimicked from this first title, The Obstacle is the Way, is being very process-oriented in my classroom.
And how so? Give an example.
So if I assign a chapter of reading, so if it's To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, I'm not going to give a quiz on the entire chapter. I'm not going to expect them to have anything memorized when they come in. The expectations now are I'm going to give them a small section when they get into class that they're going to have to reread, and they're going to have to write a paragraph response on that question. And the process of writing that paragraph is going to be drilled by making sure we start with the topic sentence, and what does that topic sentence have to do, and how do you provide context for the textual evidence that you're going to provide, and then how do you choose good textual evidence, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So making sure that I break that process down, and I expect a lot from them in that small section of reading, but what it's forcing them to do is the students who are diligent students and who go home and they read that chapter, when they come back to that section in class, it's the second read now, and maybe the third read to write the response. The student who doesn't go home and read it, at least they have to come back into class and read it. So now they're at least engaging with the text for that short amount of time. So, I think that strategy is helping at least hold them accountable to reading enough of the work. Obviously, I can't force them to read when I'm not around them.
Right, of course.
But I think what's kind of mimicked in one of the chapters in Obstacle is the Way is there's a quote from Nick Saban, who's the head football coach for the University of Alabama, maybe the most successful football coach of all time. And he never talks about winning championships, never talks about winning the SEC championship, never talks about winning national championships. He instead focuses on winning the play that's in front of them, or winning the drill that's in practice.
Oh, wow. Really breaking it down.
Really breaking it down.
Yeah.
And I think as a coach, I do a pretty good job at it. It could always be better, but a pretty good job with my athletes. But then I started to kind of retrain myself. This is how I need to teach. I need to teach the exact same way, and making sure that there's a process and that kids get really comfortable with that process. And it's not, hey, we need to write the full essay. We need to read the full novel. We need to break this down into smaller pieces.
Right, and as they construct a very concise and well-written response, and that builds up to...
That's the hope.
That builds up to the winning game.
Absolutely.
Right.
Right.
Well, you mentioned your books. Let's talk about some of these books that you bought. The first one is The Obstacle is the Way. We'll have this on the slide so you guys can see that. Why are you reading this? Why did you pick this one up? And
so I've
tell us about it.
taught Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell novel, to my sophomores for the last few years, and I've been trying to find some pieces to pair with it.
Okay.
And as I was doing a review, this came up, so I bought it, and it actually does not pair well with Outliers at all.
Outliers is a series of shorter stories that Malcolm Gladwell comes up with. He's a, big-time author in the field.
Right, so there are different narratives about success and how people become successful and how certain perceived disadvantages are actually advantages.
Okay.
So when I saw Obstacles the Way, I was thinking this would be another one of the, let's look at all these disadvantages that someone has. But it's really more about overcoming adversity. It's not necessarily the social study that Gladwell's doing. It's much more of a book about that you can grab during difficult times in your life, or if you got a big business meeting or a big game or a big event in your life that you can reach to, and you can read about some historical figures that have overcome certain adversities. It provides a lot of anecdotes for me to be able to use in my classroom and be able to motivate students or my players or even my own kids. So, and something for me to grab onto, because sometimes there's days that are tough. Or,
absolutely.
So I enjoy this. I think there's great power in using analogies and anecdotes in the classroom and in coaching and life. Yeah. So, and there's a lot in here that I like. So it's one of those books that you can leave on your nightstand and kind of pick up and grab something from it quickly, and that's it.
So the obstacle is the way. That's the whole point of all of the stories that you come across in there.
Correct.
Yeah. So you'll see that one on the slide. The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. And then you have, you bought another book in Conscious Coaching, which we know why you bought that one in.
Right.
By Brett Bartholomew. Now, this is the art and science of building the buy-in, or building buy-in. So what is this about?
So this is about culture building, having a good culture and climate for a team. It's definitely athletically oriented, but a lot of this is still I could use in the classroom and in coaching. So Bartholomew is a strength coach, and he's worked with Olympic athletes. He's worked with high school athletes, a wide range of athletes. And the one impressive thing is he references over 70 studies in this book. So the bibliography is really extensive. The research is really sound. I'm not crazy about the way it's organized necessarily, and I think that comes back to my desire to jump around and pull something.
Right.
But he has a great analogy in there that I love, and he talks about this idea of he was driving down the road, heading somewhere, and got lost, and his GPS rerouted him, and he was frustrated, he was angry, he was feeling kind of panicked because he was going to be late, and the GPS is rerouting, and ultimately, it takes a different path, and he gets there. And this analogy for so much of what we have to do in our lives, we get rerouted, and how are we going to respond to it? The anger, the frustration, and the panic is doing very little for us. And so how do I get my athletes to, when we get rerouted, when we give up 3 runs in the first inning, how do we stay the course, and how do we adjust to whatever is in front of us? And the same thing with my students. How do we when they get rerouted all the time? They have certain adversities that they're facing at home, certain struggles that are not allowing them to maybe get their work done to the best of their ability, or their girlfriend breaks up with them, or whatever. There's all these adversities that high school kids are facing, and it'd be easy to just brush them off as, that's high school stuff, but that's very real to them. So how do we get them to overcome some of these?
Teaching would be great if you had such a static environment to work in. If you lived in a glass bubble, communicating with kids who are 13, 14, 15 years old, going through
all kinds of changes,
hormones and everything else,
absolutely.
and then you're trying to relate to them some real life skills that they're going to use. Yeah.
Sure.
It would be wonderful if it was in the glass bubble, but they're not. So this helps with dealing with it. Helps them to helps you to work with them, and helps them to see it as well.
I think it definitely helps to inform my decisions in terms of how I address certain issues and how I talk to kids. And I think the packaging is so important. The way you say things is so valuable, and I think some of this book definitely addresses that. It also provides archetypes for the different types of athletes that you might encounter, but these transcend sport. It's just people, and he has a qualifier in there, like a disclaimer in there, not to put anyone in a bubble, but he goes to these different archetypes. So one would be the leader archetype, or one would be the self-sabotager, or the perfectionist. And so it goes through explaining the qualities of that person and how the good things about coaching them, the struggles of coaching them, and then it provides a psychological evaluation from a case study. So that's where all these references come in. They cite. So my favorite's the self-sabotager, because that's the kid who has the ability, but there's that mental gap in there saying that they can't do it, and how do we get to that kid? And I feel like that might have been me when I was an athlete, that maybe there was the ability, but at times I couldn't free myself up to enjoy the moment, and I really when I'm coaching that player or even that student who is afraid to get up and speak in front of the class, or feels that they can't write. I can't write. I'm a terrible writer.
Right.
I love that experience. That's the kid I want to reach, and so it gives a nice kind of some different approaches to try for that.
Yeah, I imagine getting that student or player over the gap is the reward, is why you do what you do.
Certainly,
right?
yeah, it is, and there's so many factors that go into it. It's never the one teachable moment or the one teacher or the one coach. There's so many other factors, but you like to be a small part of that progress, definitely.
Which is almost easier than being a parent, because the results of your hard work with them aren't going to be shown for a while,
Right.
So, a third book you bought in is Practical Wisdom: The Right Way to Do the Right Thing by Barry Schwartz.
Barry Schwartz.
Yeah. Okay.
I think this is the best nonfiction book I've ever read.
Ooh.
To be honest with you.
Wow.
I love this book.
He's a reader too, so this is something.
I think Barry Schwartz is brilliant, and I think if you have an opportunity to read anything that he's written, to do it, but also watch his TED Talks.
I was just going to say, I just saw a TED Talk of his that, what's he famous for, the one?
So the one is the paradox of choice.
Yes, that
so
one.
the salad dressing analogy that he uses. But he talks about how we have all these procedures and systems in place in our courts, in our, of course, our legal system, and in hospitals and schools, and it's removing our ability to be practical and nuanced and understanding context of situations in good decision making. So he gives this example of a professor, University of Michigan professor. He's a professor of archaeology. He brings his 7-year-old son to a Detroit Tigers baseball game. And you might have heard this. This was on NPR as well.
Okay.
But brings him to a baseball game. His son wants lemonade. So dad goes up to get him a lemonade, and dad's lost in his professorial thoughts. He buys him a Mike's Hard Lemonade, not realizing that there was alcohol in it. And so he brings it down to the kid. The kid opens it. He's drinking it. And a security guard sees it.
Oh.
Calls the police. The father is arrested. The kid is taken to the hospital for alcohol poisoning tests, which came back negative. He only had a couple sips of it. Mm-hmm. And the son was placed in child protective services for 3 days.
Geez.
And the father, once he was released from prison, being held, had to go into a hotel for a week. It was not, and mother was allowed to pick up the son, but the father couldn't be around. And every explanation from the security guard, the police officer, to the judge was, well, we're just following procedure. We're following procedure. And I understand, and Schwartz understands as well why those procedures are in place. Obviously we don't want to return a child to a parent that is maybe harming them. But in this situation, it needed a little bit of reason. So there's definitely rules that are good, but rules can be, we need to be able to exercise our ability to understand nuance and realize that this child was not in harm, and the father made a mistake, and it shouldn't have gone to that. So I don't, in terms of how I kind of use this, is I don't want to go back to, well, I'm just following policy and not allow context to matter. I want context to matter whenever there's a situation that arises. And of course, as a teacher and somebody who works in a school, there's policies and there's rules. And I want to respect those, but I also want to hopefully exercise practical wisdom and know that the context of the situation matters. And so he points that out, and there's so many examples that are really just well done, and it's shifted the way I think about kind of the world, and I think that's pretty powerful if a writer can do that for us.
Absolutely, yeah. So he talks about the way to get in touch with the wisdom that we already have,
right?
Which many of us don't think of ourselves of having any wisdom, because you think of wisdom, you think of, oh, I want to think of the Greeks and all the famous people who are long gone, and but we all have experiences that create a certain education, learning of us, and wisdom inside of us, and to rely on that.
Definitely, and I think I've so many examples of seeing that as a teacher, and I remember early in my career, and it's a kind of a strange example, but there was kids in the hallway that were they were bouncing a basketball back and forth to each other, and it was outside of a 0-hour classroom, so there was a class going on. And my first instinct, I was 23 or 24, was like to go guns blazing. And a more veteran teacher popped out of his classroom and walked up to them very passively and was like, "Gentlemen, you think Mom would appreciate you bouncing the ball in the house? Because right now this is our home here, and we're not going to act that way." And they're laughing and they're like, "We got you. We'll stop." And I would have messed that up. I would have been very forceful, and they would have probably been like, "Who's this guy?" And so I think that's experience. That's understanding. This is how you deal with is how you deal with people, and this is having the understanding of context and nuance. And you learn that from trying, you learn that from failing, and you learn that from experience.
And from others with experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. And then we have a fourth book you bought with us, which is going to go a little bit different from where we've been going.
Sure.
The Handmaiden's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Now, this is for those of you who don't know, it's a fiction book, and it's hugely popular now. This came out how long ago?
I think in '84.
Yeah, so Margaret Atwood wrote this book, 1984, and after the election or so, you're going to say, it just has had a resurgence in popularity.
I think the elections definitely created the resurgence. I think the miniseries,
the TV series on
Hulu. It's on Hulu.
Yeah.
And I broke a cardinal rule of mine, which my students are going to call me out on this, but I watched the series before I read the book, and I know, and the series made me very uncomfortable at times. And I watched it with my wife, and there's some time periods in there where you're just it's terrible what's going on to the women in the story. And I felt like if I could be so uncomfortable watching this writing has to be amazing, and I got to pick this book up and read it. So I've just started it. I'm only a couple chapters in, and I wish I had read more. I'd like to read a sample because the writing's really beautiful. Margaret Atwood is very talented.
Excellent writer.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So.
Right, and then you, with your nonfiction, it's easier for you to read. Like you said, you could just pick it up and put it down, and then. But fiction is a little different beast because you're following a storyline. It's for my work, I read like 5 different books. I'm listening to 2 different books, and I read like 3 other books. And the one on my nightstand is the one I struggle with the worst because it's when I'm going to bed, and of course I'm tired, so I only can pick up. Right. I can only read a couple pages at a time. So. That's probably not very fair to the book I'm reading at that point, but yeah, so it's a little difficult to keep up with some of them, but but I like the mix of nonfiction, which I'm listening to a really good book right now, Killers of the Flower Moon, about these murders on the Osage Indian Reservation and the origins of the FBI in the 1920s. It's fascinating, but we'll talk about that some other time, but we're just talking about like the mix of nonfiction and fiction and why we're reading it. I read a lot because I have to read these certain books for my job. I rarely, that one I did pick up on my own actually. So it is funny, like why do we pick up, and I know that you're reading this now because of this point in your life, and of course the school, you're reading this for school.
Right, I could potentially teach this to my second semester seniors, so. If it's going to make me really uncomfortable, then it's going to make them uncomfortable as well, which is probably something that's good for them.
Sometimes it's good.
We need that.
Yeah.
So, it is interesting how we shift in terms of what we read and how we consume text. So, I think some of the coaching part of it, I feel like maybe some others are more. They've got more of an ability, an understanding of it. And I feel like I have to go back to the text. They have to read about it. To feel more confident and informed in the decisions.
You've only
that
been coaching for 6 years, you said?
With the varsity, right.
With the varsity, so that's still pretty young.
It is.
You've got guys who devote their whole life.
Correct.
We know somebody like that.
Absolutely,
right?
Yes.
30 years.
That's a lot of experience.
Yeah. Well, George, I want to thank you for being here today, and thank you all for watching. We have. We'll be back next month with our show in October, hopefully, and talking about more of the new releases. I'm so thankful that we had George here today because he is not only a great guy, but he's a local. He's grown up here in Palos Heights, and he's seen a lot of changes here. But he continues to live and grow in a community and can contribute to it in so many different ways. So thanks for being here. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.